And volatility has been, it is not something new which the world economy is today experiencing. In fact, if you recall, starting from the Great Depression, and there are so many developments in between, but in the last 2 or 3 decades, we had the 1982 Latin American debt crisis, 1997-98, the Asian financial crisis, 2007-8, the global financial crisis, and just when we were thinking that things were slightly improving, the globe was hit by the Eurozone crisis, followed by the debt crisis in some of the European countries. And today we are facing a situation of slow growth in China, which had been recording about 8 to 9% plus growth in the last several years. The Chinese economy has slowed down. European economies continue to be very slow, which have therefore a very significant impact on the global demand. The global demand today has become very sluggish. As a result, the commodity prices are also falling. The fall in commodity prices creates various kinds of problems for various other countries. Of course, in certain manner and in a great extent, we as a country in India, we do derive certain benefits and certain advantages of the fall in the commodity prices. But with regard to it also leads to a lot of surge in imports into countries like India, which have their adverse impact on the domestic manufacturing sectors. So today the global economy is faced by uncertainty and volatility, mainly on account of, as I said, slow growth in China and Eurozone. We have the volatility arising from currency exchange rate fluctuations, the recent experience in China and the other countries, which did impact India also, but not as much as it did in 2013. In fact, the fall in the depreciation of the Indian rupee in 2013 was far bigger than what we experienced or what we are experiencing at the moment. And then we have the US taper effect, which has been discussed and debated for several years. And there is anticipation that probably US, thanks to their job figures, the employment figures, the US would perhaps begin to slow down the monetary expansion policy which they had followed, and probably there would be a rate increase. We do not know. We have to wait for the announcement of the Fed on 17th. But G20 as a forum, I think in the G20 forum, in the last meeting of the finance ministers in Turkey, this whole idea of monetary policy of large countries affecting the world economy as a whole, I think that point has been stressed by one and all. And we are sure, and I'm sure that the US administration has taken note of this aspect, and whatever they do, they would do in a very calibrated and cautious manner, in a way that it does not affect or it does not adversely impact the stability or the efforts being taken by the global community towards restoring stability in the world economy. Then we have the uncertainty and the volatility in the global scenario is also caused by several geopolitical events. The problems of terrorism, the problems of drug money, the problems of flight of capital through various unaccounted and unrecognized non-banking channels, that also is adding to the global volatility. So in all this scenario, I think it is necessary for each country to work in unison with its neighbors, to work in coordination with the other member countries of the global community to restore global growth and make it sustainable. I'll focus a little bit on India. So far as before going to India, I would also like to highlight that while talking on all these problems which today confronts the global economy, there are certain silver linings. We should not forget about these aspects, because otherwise the outlook would become very gloomy. I mean, we have to always recognize each challenge also poses certain opportunities. The silver linings are the US-Iran deal, which is, I think, now moving in a very constructive and in a very positive direction. The shale gas revolution, which the United States has pioneered and which is now being sort of taken up by other countries. There are expected innovations in solar technology, which it is expected would add to global energy security and make it accessible to people who are in far-flung areas and not necessarily connected by the grid. There are developments around the coordinated G20, the global fight against terrorism, and the problem of black money, to bring in all this wealth which is escaping the tax net, or which is money which should logically belong to the public exchequer of various countries, which is going outside this tax net, and which is probably finding its way to finance terrorism, narcotics and other kinds of illegal activities. This exchange of information initiative and the other initiatives taken probably is bringing all these, all these unaccounted, all this black money, what we call in India, into a more regulated environment. So there are silver linings, and while we recognize that the world economy today has become volatile, which many people say has become the new normal, there are also opportunities, there are also silver linings, and the global community, the G20, needs to capitalize on this. Now, so far as India is concerned, the government position has been, and it has been articulated on a number of occasions, is that India perhaps remains as one of the very few bright spots in the global economy. And it was quite heartening to note that the president of the IMF used exactly the same words to say that India today represents one of the few bright spots in the world. But that is no cause for complacency, and India as a country, the government, we are committed to sort of continue, take necessary measures to retain that position for India. Now, why India today is considered as one of the few bright spots? Because of various reasons. I mean, it is all known to you. I am not going into the details of that. The twin deficits, the current account deficit and the fiscal deficits, are well in control. Last year, the fiscal deficit was achieved. We slightly bettered the budgeted targets. This year, the budgeted target will be met, and the government is working towards that. The revenue figures are looking buoyant. There is some concern with regard to the corporate profits having come down and affecting the corporate results, and therefore the direct tax collections. But the indirect tax collections have been very buoyant, and I am sure overall the tax numbers the government will be able to achieve. Whatever has been budgeted for, it will be achieved. In this background, the government is giving a lot of focus on stepping up the budgeted public expenditure. This year, if you look at the accounts for the first, for up to end of July, which have been released by the Controller General of Accounts very recently, about a week or so ago, the expenditure in capital side, the capital account expenditure has been substantial. In fact, the growth is something like, I do not recall the figure correctly, but it's about 26% or so more than what was the capital expenditure last year. Now, this represents a very good sign and a very good initiative which the government has taken. The government is giving a lot of emphasis on stepping up the expenditure, the public expenditure on roads, on railways and other things, to see that there is considerable amount of economic activity at the grassroots level, there is job creation, and there is demand generation at the field level. Now, apart from CAD and the fiscal deficit, the foreign exchange, the forex reserves today are also fairly comfortable. Now, I mentioned about the low commodity prices, which have posed a challenge, but there are positives for India. Now, the crude prices having fallen have given a new kind of opportunity for India, because they have an impact on lowering the level of inflation. They have also had a very positive and sobering effect on our subsidy expenditure, and they also have a positive effect in lowering the input costs for manufacturing. It is true that the steel sector is today facing problem because of surge in imports of steel from various other countries at cheap prices. But today the point remains that there are other sectors, downstream industries in our economy, like automobiles, machine good manufacturers, power equipment manufacturers who consume a lot of steel. They are getting it at a cheaper price. And overall, it also has a sobering effect on the input costs, and therefore, to that extent, these sectors of our economy are likely to become more competitive globally. Cement is also another area where I think the falling prices should be helpful to the construction sector. So the low commodity prices have certain positives for India, and it is our endeavor to capitalize on these opportunities. Now, the other thing, I mean, a lot has been talked about the Chinese, the currency volatility and the Chinese overcapacity in commodities and manufacture of steel, aluminum and other things. But one area which is a kind of a silver lining, or where India is sufficiently insulated, is that India is not a part of Chinese manufacturing value chain. So to that extent, our manufacturers or our component manufacturers, our SMEs are not to that extent dependent on the success of the Chinese manufacturing sector as some of the other countries in this region would be. India, therefore, today presents a very stable picture, and it's also reflected in the fact, despite the stock market volatility, stock market prices do go up, do go down. So that is not at all a ground for any knee-jerk reaction or any sort of it should not lead to a kind of any knee-jerk policy response from the government. This is something which do happen due to large number of external factors and not necessarily due to domestic factors. But positives are that the FDI inflows, the equity FDI inflows into India have increased. I have the figures with me. The first quarter of 15-16, the FDI inflow, equity inflow, that is FDI equity inflow into India was about 60,300 crores, which works out to 40%. It's 40% increase, or 40% higher than the Q1 of last year, Q1 of 14-15. So there are positives for India, and these positives need to be capitalized so that we as a country are able to create the kind of employment which this economy requires. If I can summarize the initiatives of the government, since the Honourable Minister has already touched upon the G20 issues, I am not going into greater length into the various G20 issues and India's position on that, which has been very well articulated by the Minister already. But I'll just mention that given the global crisis that is sort of experienced all around, various countries are taking their initiatives, and similarly we in India are also taking large number of initiatives, which I would just try to briefly touch upon. There's a basically, if I can put it this way, there's a three-pronged approach which the government is taking to deal with the current economic environment, the current economic situation. First is the focus on governance, improving the governance efficiency. Second is to strengthen our macroeconomic fundamentals, strengthen the resilience factor inherent in Indian economy. And third, creating and seizing the opportunities which the current situation throws up. I will touch upon each of them one by one. With regard to governance, you are aware that the process of decision making today in governance has become very fast. A proposal is initiated, it is discussed in interministerial meetings, and then within about just 2 to 3 weeks and less than a month, the decision takes, the government takes a decision, if required at the cabinet level, or whoever is the competent authority, the minister or the prime minister, whoever is the competent authority takes that decision. So decision making in governance has become faster. If you list out the number of decisions which have been taken over the last year or so, the number is very large, and I don't want to go into the details of these various decisions which have been taken. The focus in all this decision making is to give a spur to investment, to revive our economy, and last but not the least, to improve the quality and the speed of delivery of public services. Today, the direct benefit transfer, the targeted distribution of subsidies, the LPG subsidy, for example, has resulted in considerable amount of savings in fiscal terms for the government. And there is renewed focus on transparency and there is tremendous amount of emphasis on ease of doing business. A large number of initiatives have been taken to make the environment of business, to make the investment climate free from, to unshackle the kind of restrictions or regulations which existed, the number of clearances that were required, and efforts in this direction will continue. So this is a part of the overall thrust of the government to improve efficiency of government, efficiency of governance, to ensure that investments or other kinds of initiatives which are taken, they do not face the unnecessary bureaucratic or the administrative shackles. Second initiative, which the second area of focus for the government, is strengthening our macroeconomic stability and resilience of the inherent resilience of the Indian economy. As I mentioned, the current account deficit and the fiscal deficit are very important priority areas for the government. The current account deficit is being monitored closely by the Reserve Bank of India and the Finance Ministry and the RBI. We are working in very close cooperation to ensure that whatever new challenges come up are addressed in time and in a manner that the current account deficit is maintained within manageable limits. The figures were released last Friday for the, the end July figures were released by the RBI. You are aware of that, and it shows an improvement over the corresponding period of the previous year. Now, the focus of the government is on domestic investment, how to give a spur on the domestic investment. Last week, the Honourable Prime Minister had a meeting with captains of industry, with economists and with other experts, with leaders from the banking industry, and a number of new ideas, a number of new suggestions have been thrown up, and all those points have been taken note of by the government, and whatever is doable will be sort of operationalized and will be acted upon. It was a very good interaction, a very positive interaction, and I think the discussion, which was the idea, this idea of having a discussion has definitely given a lot of confidence both to the government and to the private sector that together we can do it, and we can sort of maintain and see that the investment tempo is built up. The government is also committed to give and promote domestic savings. Domestic savings, as you know, have come down over the years. A number of measures are being taken. If I can mention in passing the gold bond scheme, which has been announced again last year based on the cabinet decision, we expect that the gold bond scheme would result in conversion of lot of idle assets which is held by, in the form of gold, which is held by Indian households. We do expect large quantum of that to get monetized under the gold monetization scheme, or and also we all expect that the gold bond scheme would win away people from investing in gold as an instrument of savings, to instead of doing that, putting that money into these gold bonds, which are being offered as sovereign bonds. Now, while offering the gold bonds, as as I had explained and as the government has explained, the government is very careful to see that whatever additional borrowing is done, it is within the overall fiscal deficit target of the government for the current year. Now, while doing so, the emphasis is also on building resilience of the poor and the disadvantaged sections of our society. Various schemes like the Jan Dhan, the Atal Pension Yojana, and other social security schemes which are being introduced by the government are measures in this direction. The third point, which I mentioned in the three-pronged approach, is creating and seizing the opportunities. Public investment are to be fast-tracked. I was just having a quick chat with the Minister for Railways. We had a discussion even earlier. The railway projects and the capital expenditures, whatever is provided in the budget, he has taken the necessary initiative to see that they will be spent gainfully and productively in the current year. The Finance Minister is having regular meetings with other key ministries like the Roads Ministry, the Shipping Ministry, and other spending ministries in infrastructure sector to see that these problems and these expenditures are maintained. So public investment will be fast-tracked and are being fast-tracked. The banking sector, which poses a big challenge, steps are being taken to de-stress the banking sector. The Department of Financial Services has already announced several governance reform measures in that sector. Recapitalization provisions have been made and augmentation of resources have been announced. But I think we need a much more structured approach to deal with the problem of stressed assets in the banking. And at this point of time, without going into details,